Have you ever stood on your own doorstep and realized you no longer belonged there? When I returned from a somber trip to lay my husband's sister to rest, I expected to find the porch light on, the warm hum of home waiting behind the door. Instead, I found my life boxed up and dumped like trash. My favorite reading lamp, a gift from my late husband, was lying sideways on the doormat. My suitcase sat against the azalea bushes, half unzipped, its contents exposed to the crisp autumn air. Taped to a photo frame of my son and me, taken on his last birthday, was a folded piece of paper. 5 words. No warning, no explanation, just a quiet erasure written in my son's familiar script. Sorry, Mom, we need the space. In that moment, I understood something deeper than betrayal had occurred. It wasn't just about being pushed out of a house, it was about being replaced. My entire existence deemed an inconvenience, my decades of history edited out without a second thought. The air was still that evening in Cedar Creek, the kind of heavy quiet that precedes a thunderstorm. I had only been gone for 4 days. Nothing dramatic had happened before I left. No arguments, no lingering tension, at least none I had allowed myself to see. The house had been calm. Leo had even hugged me at the car, a quick, perfunctory embrace. His wife, Chloe, promised she'd water the gardenias. But as I stepped from the rideshare onto the driveway, a cold dread settled in my stomach. The porch light wasn't on. The windows were dark voids. Then I saw the rest of it. A plastic storage bin filled with my sewing supplies. On top sat a pillow I had embroidered myself, its edges frayed with time. 2 framed photographs, one of my Richard, one of the 3 of us when Leo graduated from college. My life curated and discarded. I stood still for a long while. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. There was nothing to say to a locked door. I lifted my suitcase, carefully placed the photos inside, and tucked the lamp under my arm. I walked away without looking back. My steps were silent on the pavement. No one opened the curtain to watch me go. The silence was louder than shouting ever could be. At the corner of the street, I stopped and turned around just once. The porch was still dark. It was no longer my home. I spent that first night on a bench near the community garden just a few blocks away. It wasn't comfortable, but I wasn't ready to call anyone. I needed silence, not the cold, rejecting silence of my house, but the soft, unassuming kind that lives in the pre-dawn air and the rustle of maple leaves. The garden had always been my place of calm. Years ago, before Chloe came into the picture, Leo helped me build a compost bin there. I taught him how to trim herbs without damaging the roots. Now, I sat in that same spot, older, stiffer, piecing together the fragments of a life I thought I knew. As the sun began to rise, I walked to the bus stop. I had no destination. I just needed to move. By mid-morning, I found myself in a newer part of town, walking past a row of sleek townhouses. Chloe had mentioned them once, calling them an upgrade. Through the sheer curtains of a corner unit, I spotted them. Leo was standing near a minimalist dining table. Chloe sat across from him, flipping through a folder, her expression focused and sharp. She laughed, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. Leo offered a tight, fleeting smile. She held up a real estate brochure, the glossy photo of a stark white kitchen visible even from the street. She pointed at it with manicured enthusiasm. Leo looked away. He picked up a mug but didn't drink. His eyes drifted toward the window, and for a split second, I thought he saw me. He didn't. He wasn't looking at anything at all. Chloe said something else, and Leo nodded slowly. His shoulders slumped in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager who didn't want to argue. That was when something inside me shifted. All the tiny, disconnected moments from the past few months clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. The time Chloe insisted on handling the utility bills, claiming it was easier for me. The way Leo avoided talking about the house whenever I brought up repairs. The unfamiliar mail addressed to him, at my address. The small hesitations in his voice. I hadn't missed the signs. I had chosen not to see them. I stood there until the curtain moved slightly, as if brushed by an unseen hand. My legs felt heavy as I walked away, not from exhaustion, but from a growing weight I couldn't yet name. There was no confrontation, no banging on the glass, just the quiet, chilling realization that this was not a spontaneous decision. It was planned, calculated, and I had been the last to know. The morning after, I wandered into the public library, not for books, but for the anonymity and the charging outlets. My phone had died sometime during the night. I found a corner near a window, plugged it in, and let it buzz back to life. A single notification blinked on the screen, a missed call from Leo, timed at 11:42 p.m. No voicemail, no text. He hadn't followed up. A familiar voice broke the quiet. "Eleanor. Eleanor Vance, is that you?" I turned and saw Isabel Rossi. We hadn't seen each other in nearly 6 years. She had been a colleague of mine when I worked in legal insurance review. Smart, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who read the fine print with a magnifying glass. We hugged briefly. She asked what brought me in, and I gave a vague answer about passing the time. She nodded, sensing my reluctance to talk. She offered me a coffee from the machine down the hall, and we sat near a side window. After some light chatter, she leaned in. "It's funny," she said, stirring her cup. "I ran into your daughter-in-law, Chloe, last week at a property mixer. She was all smiles, talking about plans for the house. Mentioned they might be listing it soon." Isabel paused, her gaze steady. "I assumed you had already downsized." I didn't answer right away, but my silence was an answer in itself. Isabel read my face like a legal document. She sat up straighter. "Something's not right here, is it?" Slowly, I nodded. She asked if I had access to the house title. "I used to," I whispered. She urged me to double-check the ownership details. She told me about a case she once handled where a daughter-in-law, armed with a quiet power of attorney, had moved her mother-in-law into assisted living and flipped the house in less than 6 weeks. The color drained from my face, not from fear, but from the cold shock of recognition. I had brushed off so many moments. Chloe offering to manage the bills. Leo forgetting to give me the insurance notice. My missing checkbook last spring. They weren't accidents. They were brush strokes in a larger, darker picture. Isabel offered to help. She still did part-time consulting for women navigating complicated family transitions. "I've seen too many mothers edged out of their own homes by paperwork and polite lies," she said, her voice firm. She handed me her card. We sat in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of old friends who know when words are not needed. Later that day, I walked to the post office and rented a small P.O. box. It was just a metal drawer in a federal building, but it was mine, a place to redirect my mail, a place to reclaim my name. That evening, as I watched the sunset from the window of the shelter I had checked into, I felt something other than sadness. It was a quiet clarity. The storm wasn't over. But now, finally, I was turning to face it. The old key still worked. I hadn't stepped foot inside my old studio in over 5 years, but my hand knew the turn, the slight resistance in the lock. The second-floor space above a quiet bookstore used to be where I met clients, back when I did part-time consulting for insurance claims after my husband Richard passed away. I'd kept the lease as a sort of quiet retreat. The air smelled of dust and lemon oil, the faint trace of printer ink and dried lavender. I ran my fingers along the old desk where I used to sort through policy paperwork and pension forms for widows who had no one else to help them. In a back cabinet, beneath a stack of manila folders, I found what I was looking for: the original deed and a notarized copy of the title. All of it, still solely in my name. Leo's name wasn't mentioned anywhere. I sat at the desk and spread the documents out. There was more. I found the co-ownership agreement Richard and I had drawn up. It explicitly stated that upon the death of one spouse, the other retained full and indivisible rights. We had never added Leo. We wanted him to make his own life, not inherit ours. Then I found the stack of recent utility bills I'd brought from the house. They were all now addressed to Chloe. My name had been wiped clean. A copy of a utility transfer request form sat on top of one envelope. The signature was a crude forgery of my handwriting. They had already begun the process of replacing me, not just in the house, but on paper. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the small fireproof safe under the desk and placed the deed and the agreement inside. I added a copy of my driver's license and the last tax return that listed the property under my name. I locked it. I looked around the room one last time. No pictures of Leo here, just a photo of Richard and me at a fundraiser, both of us laughing, both in the middle of living. They thought I was out, but they had no idea what I still held. The next morning, I stood outside Isabel's office clutching an envelope. She greeted me with her familiar no-nonsense look. I laid the documents on her desk, the deed, the ownership agreement, the forged utility requests. She skimmed every page, then leaned back. "This is no mistake, Eleanor," she said. "They're laying the groundwork to remove you. They're counting on you not fighting back." Her words didn't sting. They settled into a space that had been empty for a long time, a space where I had once been someone who acted with certainty. Isabel picked up her phone and called in a favor. Within minutes, she had a name: Diana Albright, a retired estate attorney who specialized in asset protection for older women. According to Isabel, she didn't just read contracts, she read people. 2 days later, I stood on the porch of Ms. Albright's home office. She was older than me, with short silver hair and a presence that commanded the room without filling it. I handed her everything. She read slowly, her eyes moving with surgical precision. When she was done, she folded her hands and said evenly, "None of this changes the fact that you are the sole legal owner. The utility transfers, the mail redirection, it's circumstantial, not a lawful transfer. But if they attempt to use it to leverage a sale or a refinance, that becomes fraud." She walked me through the next steps. A formal cease and desist letter, a notification to the county clerk's office to flag any attempted transactions, a soft restriction on the title that would delay any unauthorized movement. It wasn't dramatic, but it was effective. I signed the documents with a hand that did not shake. Isabel arranged for a courier to deliver one sealed envelope to Leo's office and another to Chloe's workplace, Ms. Albright also suggested filing a protective memorandum with the local real estate board, alerting them that any claim on the house not coming from me was to be treated with caution. Standing in the hallway of Miss Albright's office, I glanced in the mirror. I looked tired, but behind my eyes, something new had settled. A steadiness. A line had been drawn. They hadn't taken everything. They had just taken my silence for granted, and that was a mistake they would come to regret. By the end of the week, every letter had been sent. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone started ringing. Leo's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. He called again and again. By the 6th attempt, a message finally came in. It was from Chloe. "You didn't have to go this far." I sat with that message for a long time before sending a single line in reply. "Everything has a reason. So does this." I knew the silence would be louder than any explanation. The next evening, Leo showed up at my studio. I opened the door just enough to see his face. His eyes were tired, more confused than angry. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside, not to welcome him, but to show I wasn't afraid. He said he hadn't known about everything, that Chloe had taken the lead because she thought I needed a rest, that it wasn't supposed to escalate. I didn't interrupt. Finally, I asked one thing, not as a mother, but as a woman speaking to a man who should have known better. Why didn't you stop her? He looked at the floor. His answer came slowly. Because I didn't want the conflict. Because it felt easier. Because I didn't think you'd push back. It wasn't cruelty, it was cowardice. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen his own comfort over doing what was right. That, I realized, was its own profound betrayal. When he left, I closed the door gently behind him, not with rage, but with a quiet certainty. I had lost the illusion of family and found something steadier in its place. Myself. The next few days passed in silence. Then, on a Saturday morning, a courier arrived with a white envelope. Inside was a letter from a real estate firm, a carbon copy of an inquiry requesting documents for a pre-sale evaluation of my house. I didn't panic. I called Isabel. Within hours, Mrs. Albright had filed a second-level restriction with the property office and flagged the realtor directly with a legal notification. Any further attempt to inquire about the home would require direct, notarized authorization from me. The wall around my house was now reinforced. Still, the audacity stunned me, the attempt to pretend I had never mattered, as if the love poured into that home could be dismissed with a forged signature. That evening, Leo came again. He said Chloe had made a mistake, that she was scared I would retaliate. He kept using words like misunderstanding and oversight. I let the silence do the work. Then I looked him in the eye. You knew, Leo. You always knew. And you let it happen because it benefited you. He didn't argue. He just said he was tired, that standing between me and Chloe was impossible. In that moment, I saw it clearly. He hadn't been trapped. He had made a choice. Comfort was easier than courage. I thanked him for coming and closed the door, not with bitterness, but with the finality of someone who had seen the truth unmasked and could no longer pretend otherwise. The following morning, Isabel called me into her office. She stood by the window, holding a thick file. I think we have a problem, she said calmly. She spread the papers across her desk. It was a digital printout of a loan pre-approval application from a regional bank. It had Leo's name on it and mine. Next to my name was a signature that was a sloppy, digitized copy of my own. He had created an online joint ownership profile, submitted fabricated authorization forms, and was attempting to secure a line of credit against the house. This isn't just manipulation, Isabel said, her face tight. This is criminal. We called Miss Albright. She arrived that afternoon, her eyes sharp. He's created a fictitious authorization trail, she said evenly. That's forgery and wire fraud. She moved fast, drafting a formal complaint to the bank's fraud investigation unit and filing a notice with the district attorney's office. Then she filed a final, silent lockdown, freezing any transactions or claims made using my name unless verified by me in person. The invitation came as a text from Leo. We're having a family discussion Saturday. Hope you can come. It's time to clear the air. Ms. Albright came with me. The house was staged with fluffed cushions and scented candles. Chloe stood by the fireplace, her smile stretched too wide. We know there's been some tension, she began, her voice smooth. This is still your home, too. Mrs. Albright set her briefcase on the coffee table. Actually, she said, her voice calm but unyielding, this home belongs solely to my client, Eleanor Vance. She remains the legal owner on all official documentation. Any representations otherwise have been formally challenged. This is not a discussion, it's a confirmation. Silence fell. Brendan paled. Chloe blinked, her composure finally cracking. We are also aware of forged documents submitted to multiple institutions, Ms. Albright continued. Those filings have been reported. My client reserves the right to press charges. I stood up. I didn't yell. I just looked at them. You tried to write me out of my own life, I said. You thought I wouldn't notice. Then I turned and walked out. At the door, Miss Albright paused. If you attempt to interfere again, legal proceedings will follow immediately. Outside, the wind felt fresh, cleansing. They had wanted to bury me in paperwork, but I had shown them I was still standing. The next morning, I walked into the old house one last time. I still had the keys. I still held the deed. They were both in the dining room, waiting. I'm selling the house, I said. Kayla froze. Leo looked up, his lips parted. But where will you live? He asked, his voice cracking. That's not your concern anymore, I replied, not unkindly, but without softness. I placed a folder on the table. Inside was the listing agreement, already signed. The sale proceeds will not be going to you, I continued. I've transferred the full amount into a foundation, a fund for women over 60 who've been manipulated, discarded, or silenced by their own families. It will help them find legal support, housing, and dignity. I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped outside, closed the door gently, and walked down the path. The sun had risen, and the sidewalk glittered with early frost. I didn't look back. Instead, I opened my phone and pulled up the address of my new apartment. Small, quiet, mine. The apartment was filled with morning light. I kept things simple: a reading chair, a single photograph of me at the ocean, a lavender plant on the sill. The quiet was unfamiliar at first, not empty, just new. Isabel would visit, bringing pastries and updates on the foundation. Donations were small, but steady. One letter arrived from a woman in Utah. Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. She had written, "Thank you for existing. I read it twice." The house sold. Leo and Chloe moved out. The silence from them didn't hurt anymore. It felt like space. In the evenings, I began to write, stitching together memories in a notebook. One afternoon, rearranging a small cabinet, I found the photo from Leo's graduation. And I saw something I'd refused to see before. Someone had trimmed it. My face had been cleanly cut out, surgically removed, as if I had never stood there beside them. I stared at it for a long while, not with shock or sadness, but with a quiet, final recognition. I placed the mutilated picture in a wooden box with other relics of a life that was no longer mine. People think healing is loud, that it arrives like thunder, but sometimes it moves like breath, barely there, quiet and slow. I never erased them from my memory. I simply chose not to center my life around people who had edited me out of theirs. There is strength in letting go, not for revenge, but for peace. That spring, my new lavender plant bloomed, crookedly, reaching for the sun. It grew. And that was enough. If this story found a quiet place in you, I thank you for listening. So many women walk through years of silence before they finally choose themselves. Have you ever felt erased, not in words, but in your very presence? Your story, like mine, has weight, and sometimes in the telling or the hearing of it, we begin to bloom again, quietly, steadily, in our own time, in our own light.